Member for Moriata.
Thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to be able to speak on the supply bill, a bill that provides for the government of South Australia to continue to run programs, to pay public servants, to provide grants, continue with infrastructure projects during the period from the 1st of July 2022 until the appropriation bill effectively cuts in. The state government, the Malinowskis Labor government, has come to power. We are now on in the third sitting week, and the address and reply having been dealt with. They'd like to have the state budget this Thursday. And indeed now we're offered a supply bill because they know their state budget. As happens every year, the state budget is never finished by the end of June. And so in this House and in the Legislative Council, that bill must get passed before its money can flow. This supply bill gets us through in the interim. That's its purpose. It happens every year. The unusual thing this year, of course, is that the supply bill has been delayed so far, not just by an election, but by, obviously, 3 weeks of address and reply. And indeed, if that were to be the case, that the government was going to take so long with that, it's up to them whether the sitting calendar, providing, I think, a record low number, certainly record low number in my time in the parliament, number of sitting days being provided, that's up to them to determine. We have this supply bill now and we'll consider it. It's a large amount of money. It's an enormous amount of money, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money for the people of South Australia, and the opportunity to scrutinise this bill and deliberate on it is a fiercely held one by the parliament, and as all oppositions do, we'll give it consideration. The government having the opportunity to provide this supply bill, and obviously the opposition will support the supply bill, but the government having the opportunity to, with this supply bill, put in place its agenda from the 1st of July, it is incumbent on it, of course, to deliver on its agenda, to deliver to the people of South Australia the things that they promised to do. When the people of South Australia voted for the Malinowskis Labor government, as they did, from a Liberal point of view, disturbingly large numbers of seats, and something that I think they'll reflect on in 4 years' time if this government doesn't deliver on its commitments. Or indeed, if this government determines that they're going to undertake policies that were never discussed before the election that are contrary to the interests of the people of South Australia. With this supply bill, of course, the government has the capacity to govern. It is incumbent on this government, every member sitting opposite, or even over there, on the Labor benches. Every single member has a responsibility to their community to ensure that their ministry delivers what they said they would do when these members were pitching for election. I don't know how many of the members who are sitting in the chamber on the non-cabinet member benches for the Labor Party were aware that this government, upon coming to office, would delay the North-South Corridor project by at least a year. Judging by the Minister for Transport's answers in the House today, one can only assume that his real plans are to delay it for longer, and potentially I have limited confidence in this project at all under the current minister. Maybe one of the others would do a better job. See more interest in playing musical chairs with senior public service positions than on delivering projects for the people of South Australia, and this is problematic. We need a government focused on outcomes for the people of South Australia. Delaying that North-South corridor is not just more uncertainty for businesses who are operating along it, not just more uncertainty for residents who are now wondering whether their houses are going to be needing to be acquired under the Minister Koutsantonis's new plans for whatever he proposes to deliver there. All enormous productivity losses for the state of South Australia going forward. We wanted this corridor, the largest infrastructure project in South Australia's history, to deliver for South Australia for generations to come, and starting as soon as possible, the enormous productivity benefits for our farmers trying to get their product to market, for people trying to get to jobs more quickly, whether they're working on domestic or commercial projects or indeed civil projects. This is a tremendously important project, and it's troubling the way that it's already being slated for delay by the new minister. Today in question time, it was made very clear that universal access for preschool for all 3-year-old children in South Australia will not be available in 2026. Again, I don't know how many of the Labor members sitting in the non-cabinet benches were aware that, allegedly, according to the Education Minister, if you believe him today, that was never part of the plan. Except the Labor Party provided their members with policy documents, including one where it's very, very explicit Labor's commitment to offer 3-year-old preschool to all children in South Australia from 2026. It talks about some policy matters related to autism. Very explicit that the Labor Party went to the people of South Australia with a proposition that they wanted 3-year-olds in South Australia to have universal access to preschool, which is understood, by the way, as 15 hours of preschool-style program. In South Australia, overwhelmingly delivered in public preschools, although not exclusively. It can be delivered in non-government settings as well. A number of long daycare centres offer a preschool-style program, which is funded under the Universal Access Scheme. Either the Labor government needs to be clear with the people of South Australia about what its actual motivations and policies are, or they fail the trust of the people of South Australia after the election. Because what we heard today was very clear. The Minister set forth a series of what he described as big challenges to delivering 3-year-old preschool for all 3-year-olds in South Australia by 2026. He talked about the challenges of capacity, the fact that there are indeed, and this is true, there are a number of preschools in South Australia that have capacity to take more children, that could offer another day, for example, open for another day. They've got capacity to take more children. They could potentially take the 3-year-olds tomorrow if they were all in attendance. The state government was willing to pay for it. And indeed, we have a number of preschools in our public system, and don't forget, overwhelming majority of preschool programs in South Australia are in public preschools. We have a number of those preschools, and members may be familiar with them, where they are at capacity now, where there is no more room. Julianne Rietstra, we established, a former Chief Operating Officer, former Executive Director of Infrastructure in the Department for Education, somebody who served Liberal and Labor governments over a respected career of several decades. We established an estimate, I think it was last year, after her retirement. She reminded me that she had put the capital cost estimate of delivering 3-year-old preschool, certainly according to the public model, or the similar proportions to what are currently in the system in public preschools, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, just in capital alone. But even if, as I think the Education Minister seemed to suggest on the ABC radio a couple of weeks ago, even if you expect a large amount of the increased numbers to be in long daycare services with preschool-style programs, there is still an extraordinary cost for the state budget. $80 to $100 million, it was estimated, in the advice that was given to the former government. And if the government considers that $80 to $100 million in this program is the best way to enhance early childhood education, as they certainly seemed to suggest before the election, then well be it. The first 1,000 days of a kid's life are utterly critical. We want that to be a focus of government policy. And we want every cent of improvement to early childhood education to go to where it is going to have the most impact. And that drove the decisions that we took as a government as to how we could best enhance early childhood education with every cent made available. We'll get to the early learning strategy a bit later that we released last year, and which I hope the new government, will not be cutting in order to fund some of its new commitments. But at any rate, I don't think there is any doubt in anyone's mind on the Labor benches that they went to the election promising 3-year-old universal preschool. In fact, I was with the member for Newland and the member for King and other members, former members for Newland and King, and other members at the Modbury pre-poll booth before the election on a number of occasions. We had some friendly discussions about how politics was going. I don't know which one of the Labor members put up the poster, Labor's Plan for Education, with the big tick for universal 3-year-old preschool. Labor's plan for election, at the very least, even if it wasn't explicitly in the policy document, one might imagine that when Labor is talking about having a plan for education, you can assume they're talking about the coming term of government. Universal 3-year-old preschool. There's some specific meanings in early childhood education that go with those words. Universal access is a funding arrangement with the state and the Commonwealth. It's where the Commonwealth provides the extra 3 hours on top of the 12 hours that the state provides for 4-year-olds. So there's 15 hours of preschool per week for all of our 4-year-old children. In addition to that, at the moment, and for a number of years, certainly throughout the entire time of the Marshall Liberal government, we provided 3-year-old preschool for all South Australian Aboriginal children, and indeed for children under guardianship. In our early learning strategy, which we released in the 2021 state budget, people can see that we were looking at further considerations for further areas. Page 23, we were looking at review policy settings for an additional year of preschool for developmentally delayed children. The Minister today, in his answer to question time, identified, and he was right, there are certain cohorts of students that will get more benefit from 3-year-old preschool. Because the thing is, we have excellent long daycare services in South Australia, certainly with higher proportions of services going above the national average on the My Child website than most other jurisdictions. And indeed, we have a national quality framework that the Labor Party should be proud of. I mean, Kate Ellis, I think, was the minister who led the debate on it. It was delivered during the 2010 to 2014 period of government, the Wetherell years. They signed up to the national quality framework, during which time was required the introduction of teachers and more diploma and certificate qualified staff in our long daycare services. This ensures that while it may not always be a preschool-style setting that our 3-year-olds are in, the overwhelming majority of our 3-year-olds are in an early education setting that deserves our respect. And the educators who work in our long daycare services deserve our respect rather than being dismissed as some sort of second-class option for our children. Those children are actually doing pretty well. Yes, we want them to do better, and we must work to do better. We must work on the developmental checks. And indeed, there are a number of them who will benefit from a preschool-style setting specifically, a preschool-style program specifically. We've identified already Aboriginal children, children with guardianship, and indeed the Marshall Liberal government put on the table children with a developmental delay. And I recognise there will be other vulnerable cohorts who are not getting all the benefits of that quality framework provided for long daycare settings. And maybe there are different standards in some long daycare services than some preschools. But the point I make is this. Labor has said that the answer is 3-year-old preschool for every child. That means not what is currently being delivered, a combination of parental and Commonwealth subsidies supporting those 3-year-olds in long daycare settings. And there are some children that miss out, and they would always be better in a preschool at 3-year-old than not getting any of those early education opportunities at all. Labor's promise didn't go into this nuance. Labor's promise was universal 3-year-old preschool in South Australia, and this supply bill and the budget to follow on Thursday has the opportunity for Labor to deliver on its promise. Yes, it'll take some work. The Minister said that the Victorian government, on which they based their modelling, took 10 years, or is proposing over 10 years to roll out 3-year-old preschool. I don't even know how many of the Labor members here recall that in their talking points when they were going to community events, saying that they would roll it out over 10 years along the Victorian model in a staged approach. I don't think that was in the Labor talking points, because it certainly wasn't in their policy. Their policy, and I reference it again, Labor's commitment to offer 3-year-old preschool to all children in South Australia from 2026, Labor's election posters, Labor's plan for education, universal 3-year-old preschool. Today the Minister said, well, in 2026, from 2026, we'll start rolling it out and we'll have a Royal Commission to tell us how. Now, before the election, when Labor announced their policy, we were interested in how they were going to deliver it. As established, depending on the model, if we're talking about all public preschools, this is hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, in addition to the $80 to $100 million a year in recurrent funding required to deliver preschool-type programs, according to any of the definitions that are currently considered a preschool-type program. It's a cost to the state government, and it's a cost that I'm happy to pay if it's going to deliver massive improvements to children's education and indeed for benefits for families. But Labor's not even actually now proposing to deliver it. They are shifting the language and talking about a staged approach where certain cohorts might get there first because they've got these capacity challenges to overcome. The Royal Commission was Labor's promise. Today, when I asked the Minister to reconcile his answer, which made it clear that there was going to be this staged approach, with Labor's promises that all children in South Australia from 2026 would have access to 3-year-old preschool, switched around that quote, but it's nevertheless the quote, Labor's commitment to offer 3-year-old preschool to all children in South Australia from 2026. I asked him to reconcile it, and he said there is no problem reconciling it because our commitment wasn't that. It was that we would have a Royal Commission to advise us on how we could deliver that. He said that the Royal Commission would investigate how to have this 3-year-old preschool for all children, ideally from 2026. That's an aspiration. He talked about a lofty aspiration. That's fine. The thing is, their election promise provided $1 million for a Royal Commission. The last 2 Royal Commissions in South Australia, I note, cost 5 and 7 times that amount. But we will forgive this government if they spend more on the Royal Commission than $1 million, because they must. And it is clearly a key election promise to have this Royal Commission. If they spend only $1 million on it, it would actually, I think, be to the benefit of the Treasurer, but it would be a failure to the children and adults and families of South Australia. This Royal Commission's task, as explained by the Labor Party before the election, was to tell them how to deliver 3-year-old preschool for 2026. It's a big task. We knew it was a big task. We said that it would be expensive, and Labor said, well, we'll have a Royal Commission to deal with it. It was supposed to solve all these problems. Now, I suspect that what's happened is that since coming to government, the Education Minister has received advice that there's a cost, and to put that cost in the forward estimates would blow all of the current Treasurer's commentary about no more big projects, no more big expenses. We saw him in the Advertiser today, suggesting that further projects will be delayed. He'll blow it completely out of the water. $80 to $100 million from 2026 is what the Labor Party will have to deliver on its election commitments. And they're not going to. From the clear responses from the Minister today are that they are squibbing on this promise to the people of South Australia. It is a betrayal of the trust of the people of South Australia. When the leader of the government, the Premier, today, in his address and reply, just before I started speaking on the supply bill, as he was wrapping up the address and reply, I heard him talking at length about his description of his government's motivations to support families and children in South Australia. And I commend his government for having that as an aspiration. It was ours. Early childhood was key in our government's focus priority areas, as was education. There was never more money spent, nor focused energy spent on reforms in a 4-year period in school education in South Australia's history than the last 4 years of the Marshall Liberal government. And in early childhood education, we too had a strong commitment to reforming our delivery of early childhood education and potentially expanding the responsibilities for state government in this area. The Education Minister in question time today said that we had no policy in early childhood. Now, I put it to the Education Minister and those opposite that just because a policy is funded by government money ahead of an election rather than waiting until the election campaign itself does not make it any less a policy. And I commend to those opposite, certainly the new members who I didn't send a copy to at last year's budget, but I commend to them the document All Children Thriving and Learning, South Australia's Early Learning Strategy, which is, I believe, still on the Education Department's website. It includes from pages 20 through to the end, in fact earlier, from pages 18 through to page 28, a series of measures, some 10 or 15 measures on every page, or most pages, identifying where we're going in early childhood. Some of them were immediately funded, some of them were areas for further research, and some of them were 10-year aspirations. They're very important measures. I think the Premier, although they're now saying that we had no vision in early childhood education, I recall the Premier saying it was the best thing in that $50 million commitment, was the best thing in Rob Lucas's last 2021 budget. Labor members who were here at the time may remember it in the talking points. It was a solid body of work that was developed over a series of years aimed at targeting funding, and we accessed new funding from Rob Lucas, no less. We accessed new funding to target towards measures that would have a significant impact, a significant positive impact on children's development, because it became very clear that the AEDC census data showed that, unlike most other states, the period from of the collection of data from 2009 to 2018 showed an increase in the percentage of children developmentally vulnerable on one or more domains between 2009 and 2018, the core years of the former Labor government, where South Australia, children in a vulnerable situation increased from 23% to 24%. The only other jurisdiction that increased, by the way, was the ACT. Queensland saw a 3% decline, Western Australia a 6% decline, Northern Territory, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania all saw improvements on that developmental data, and South Australia did not. So we put in place a series of measures that will address that. measures that will look at children's vulnerabilities for early support, early diagnosis and interventions. We'll work with communities, work with NGOs, groups like Raising Literacy Australia, the Smith family and others were funded to engage in projects. And I very much hope that this new government will continue that work in the years ahead, because it will have a big impact. I urge the Minister to do so, and I urge him to fulfil his commitments to the people of South Australia on 3-year preschool, or at least have the decency to own up to the fact that it seems the Labor Party is walking away from that clear election promise.